The creator behind Concord, Firewalk Studios, has officially shut down. Concord will not be coming back. It won't become free to play, and every person at the studio that made it has been let go. Allegedly, the game cost $400 million. And because Sony offered full refunds for anyone who bought the game, it made just about none of that back. And considering they also only sold an estimated 25,000 copies and made about $1 million off of the whole thing, even if nobody took them up on that refund offer, they still made just about nothing, relatively speaking. So why does Sony put so much money into franchises like Concord, make mainly cinematic third-person movie-style games, and endless remasters and remakes of recent games, and yet completely ignore a massive catalog of IPs and mascots? I'm Peach, welcome to the pit, and here are the reasons why Sony and PlayStation have completely abandoned their old franchises and left them to die. The first reason we'll never see continuations for games like Sly, Jak and Daxter, Resistance, Killzone, and many others is because the studios behind them have simply moved on. People want to be able to stretch their creative muscles, tell new stories, try new things, and bring new ideas to life. Book writers don't want to be stuck on one single series their whole career. Painters don't want to keep painting variations of the same sunset. And game developers want to move on to new worlds to design, new characters to create and grow, and new game mechanics to innovate with. The creators of Sly Cooper, Sucker Punch Games, went on to make 3 games in the infamous series, Ghost of Tsushima, and now are working on its sequel, Ghost of Yotei. The makers of the Jak series moved on to Uncharted and then to a whole bunch of multiverse variants of the same 2 Last of Us games. Guerrilla Games, who made Killzone, have moved on to the Horizon games, and Resistance was made by Insomniac, who have now moved on to Spider-Man, other Marvel properties, and the occasional Ratchet & Clank. And they have publicly stated that they are done with the Resistance series. Although apparently 10 years ago they did pitch a 4th Resistance game, but Sony shot it down because it was, and I quote, too similar to The Last of Us. But the point I'm making is, if you're a game developer, would you really want to spend 10 to 20 years working on the same characters, enemies, world, and game mechanics? Probably not. Developers ultimately want to be able to grow their craft and push boundaries of what is possible. Funny enough, Naughty Dog even looked into creating a 4th Jak and Daxter game back in 2012 that would have been more realistic and a fresh take on the franchise, but they realized that this would be a disservice to the fans and not a game they wanted. So they shelved it and moved on to The Last of Us because in the end, they wanted to do something they hadn't done before. And they didn't want to twist Jak and Daxter into something it wasn't. So it was time to go into a new direction. Now just because the original developers don't want to work on these classic series doesn't mean a new studio can't take up the mantle. But here's the problem with that. This has already been tried a couple of times to a certain extent with Sly 4 Thieves in Time and Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier. Both of these were the last games released in their respective franchises and were developed by new studios. And both of them to this day are largely seen as the worst games in the series and were commercial failures. It's incredibly hard to take a world and characters created by somebody else and recapture the magic they made. You're always going to be in somebody else's shadow trying to live up to their legacy while attempting to make something your own by adding in your personal spin on things. It's a tough mountain to climb, and it's an incredibly hard line to walk between legacy and innovation, and most people can't. Which is why attempts by another studio to continue a series usually results in, at best, something that pales in comparison to the previous games, and at worst, something that gets completely forgotten. Another issue that ties into this is that for many of these franchises, each sequel performed worse than the last. The best-selling Resistance was the first. The highest revenue Jak game was the first. The latest Killzone entry, Shadowfall, was one of the lowest rated in the franchise. For many of these series, each subsequent game sells a little less and reviews a little worse. This is an indication of a downward trend. Players are losing interest. Like the developers, they want something new that can surprise and delight them while pushing the boundaries. And if you're Sony looking at a spreadsheet and all you see is each franchise losing steam as you pour more money into them, you're going to start looking elsewhere for a better return on your investment. And this leads me into the final and arguably the most important reason we'll never see continuations to games like Sly, Killzone, Resistance, and others, is the simple fact that they don't make that much money. At least in comparison to current franchises. The entire Sly franchise, minus Thieves in Time, sold a whopping, can I get a drum roll please, 2.2 million copies. 3 games, 2.2 million copies across the board. Now compare that to Sucker Punch's most recent game, Ghost of Tsushima, which sold 13 million copies with 1 game. A third of the number of games, 6 times the amount of copies sold.
16 times the detail.
If we take a look at the last Killzone game, it sold 2.1 million copies shortly after release. Unfortunately, Sony never released updated numbers after that, which probably means it wasn't that much higher. But compare that to Horizon Zero Dawn, which sold 20 million copies. The absolute best-selling game in the Jak franchise, the first one, sold a total of 4.2 million copies. You want to know why they keep re-releasing the freaking Last of Us games? Because the two games together have sold over 37 million copies. I realize I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, and of course there's some other factors in here, like more money being put into development and marketing, and some of these games have also released on PC, which will boost the numbers sold. But I hope you get the idea. Businesses go where the money and the market goes. And as much as Sony says they're for the players, they're still in the business of making money. And when you look at a franchise from a bygone era that at its peak sold a fraction of what the current hits are selling, you're going to put your money elsewhere. Even something like the incredibly popular Bloodborne that people constantly clamor Sony to remaster re-release only sold 7 million copies, which is still a ton for sure, but it's far less than most of Sony's other new IPs. And heck, the developers of Bloodborne's most recent game, Elden Ring, has sold 23 million copies. Do you think they'll really want to go back to working on one of their less popular franchises? And while I and many other people would love new entries in these beloved franchises, the cold hard truth is most of these will probably never be revisited. They didn't make as much money compared to the bigger PlayStation franchises now. A lot of the recent installments didn't get received very well or are on a downward trend, and the main studios behind them simply don't want to return, at least for now. And attempts by other studios to work on these games haven't gone that well. When every sequel gets less sales than the previous, your choices are to either reboot or put it to rest. And unfortunately, Sony has chosen the latter. Now for some of these games, I think we'll still see some basic ports and remasters like they did for Sly 1 on the PS5 because they're relatively cheap to make, and for other games a reboot might still be in the cards. It worked incredibly well for Ratchet & Clank and God of War, and we can't fully rule it out. But will the creators even want to return, and will Sony risk it? I guess only time will tell. And the reason Sony invests in games like Concord or Fair Game $, is they know they need more popular and established franchises that they can rely on to sell consoles and build upon. They need to keep innovating to stay competitive. And I know people might say, well, they must have known Concord wasn't going to sell well, so why do they throw so much money into that? Unfortunately, I think they thought it was going to be massive. Based on insider knowledge, Sony outright buying the studio who made it, of which Concord was their only game, and the fact that it has its own dedicated episode in Amazon's secret level TV series, assuming that's still even coming out, makes me think that Sony genuinely thought that Concord was going to be the new Overwatch and the next massive franchise for them. They definitely should have done more market research into that. But they know that their old franchises probably aren't going to be mega hits, so they might as well build up the popular ones and try to create and invest in a new hit. From a corporate standpoint, that would be their best bet. And the sad result of that is a lot of our favorite games may be left in the past. But the exciting prospect is that we may get new franchises and games that are better than ever. Or they'll keep getting things wrong until they learn what the majority of gamers actually want. But hey, that's marketing. Personally, I think Sony should make a Resistance reboot. I've always felt there's a lot of untapped potential in that series, and they have a huge FPS gap they could fill. What do you guys think that would be a successful reboot or sequel that Sony should make? Let me know down in the comments. After that, hit subscribe if you like what you saw, and watch one of the videos on screen for more great content. And until next time, stay peachy.